11 days, 11 engineers, each one credentialed, each one certain, each one walked off the hangar floor in turn, like men filing out of a room where the lights had already gone dark. $9 million of aircraft sat on Kingsley Aerospace's tarmac, with its engine cowling open to the night air, silent as a held breath. What do 4 chalk lines on a concrete floor have to do with a $9 million jet engine that 11 credentialed engineers couldn't restart in 11 days? On the 12th night, a man in a faded gray coverall, a cleaning crew patch stitched crooked at his shoulder, crouched beside the plane's left engine with a stub of yellow chalk between 2 fingers and began to draw. Vanessa Kingsley watched him from just inside the hangar door, her father's company draped over her shoulders the way it had been for 11 years, her thumb already moving toward her phone. She did not know his name. She knew only that he pushed a broom through this hangar 3 nights a week, that he had no business kneeling on her tarmac in the glow of floodlights, while men with engineering degrees packed their laptops into cases behind her, defeated. The first line he drew ran the length of the fuel line's shadow. The second crossed it at an angle that meant nothing to anyone watching. Tobias Winthrop, her lead maintenance engineer, stood with his arms folded so tightly it looked like he was holding himself together by force, and said nothing, because there was nothing left in him that hadn't already failed once tonight. Vanessa's watch caught the light when she checked it, a habit, mid-conversation, mid-crisis, mid-anything. A small gold interruption that told the room she had already decided how much longer this would go on. She had decided this would go on for exactly as long as it took security to walk across the concrete. Her thumb found the contact. The man did not look up. He tilted his head very slightly, as though listening for something underneath the low electrical hum of the hangar lights, and drew a 3rd line, and then a 4th, and the 4 lines together made a shape that looked to anyone who didn't understand it like nothing at all. Stay with this one to the end, because the 4 lines are not the strangest part of what happens on that hangar floor. Somewhere behind her, a floor manager named Graham Dalton went very still, the way a man goes still when he recognizes someone he was not expecting to see again in this lifetime, in this coverall, on his knees. Vanessa Kingsley did not notice. She was still looking at her phone, still composing the sentence that would have this man removed from her hangar before he touched anything that mattered, still certain, the way she had been certain about a great many things for 11 years, that the answer to an $83 million problem could not possibly be kneeling in front of her, wearing a patch that said custodial. She had no way of knowing yet that the 4 lines on her floor were not a stranger's idle scratching. She had no way of knowing that the answer to why her flagship jet had died on the tarmac and the answer to why it had been made to die there were 2 entirely different questions, and that the man crouched at her feet was about to answer only the first of them tonight, and that answering it would open a second door she had spent 11 years walking past without ever noticing it was there. 6 hours earlier, in a house with a chain-link fence and a maple tree just starting to lose its leaves, Samuel Nash had been kneeling on a different floor entirely, tying the laces of a small pair of sneakers that his daughter insisted, every morning, on tying herself first and getting wrong. 2 knocks came from behind Winnie's door, never 3, his signal that it was time, hers to answer by opening it herself rather than being told. She emerged already dressed, backpack half-zipped, and handed him the lunch container she'd chosen from the cabinet without being asked, the one with a faded cloud sticker on the lid that she would have noticed missing before she noticed anything else about her day. He packed it the way he packed everything, efficiently, without wasted motion, and apple-quartered instead of whole, because whole apples came back to him untouched and quartered ones did not. Winnie watched him do this the way she watched most things, quietly. From a slight distance, her head tilted in a way that was not quite her own habit and not quite anyone else's, though anyone who had known her mother would have said otherwise. Claire had been gone 3 years. Winnie had been 5, old enough now at 8, to remember pieces of her rather than a whole, the shape of a laugh, a smell that no longer attached itself to anything in the house, a habit of tapping a pencil twice against a drafting table before starting to draw. Samuel still felt her presence in smaller places than memory. He felt it in his own hands, mostly, in the particular stillness of a man who had once made a career of listening to machines the way other engineers only measured them, a stillness Claire had taught him before she'd taught it to their daughter without either of them noticing. He tied his boots at the kitchen table before his shift, an old ritual that had nothing to do with function and everything to do with the 6 minutes it bought him to sit in his own kitchen and think. 6 years ago, he had been the lead propulsion systems engineer at a defense contractor whose name he no longer said aloud, credited, briefly, before the merger swallowed the credit along with the division, with a fuel flow harmonic modeling technique that other engineers now taught as though it had arrived from nowhere. He did not resent it the way people expected him to when, rarely, the story came up. He had walked away on his own terms before anyone could ask him to walk away on theirs, because a company that could dissolve 11 years of a man's work in a boardroom in under an hour was not a company he wanted teaching his daughter what work meant. He wanted her to see him coming home. He wanted 2 knocks and a lunch with a cloud sticker on it and a father who was there, unhurried, every single morning. Winnie zipped her own backpack, refusing his help the way she refused it most mornings now, and paused at the door with the specific patience of a child who has one question and knows exactly how to ask it. "Do you like being invisible at your job?" she asked, not unkindly, the way she asked most things, like she already suspected the answer and only wanted to hear him say it. Samuel considered this the way he considered most things she said, slowly and with total seriousness. "I like being underestimated," he told her. "It leaves more room to work." She nodded, satisfied, as though this confirmed something she'd worked out on her own weeks ago, and left for school without looking back, the way Claire used to leave for the hospital in her last year, certain enough of him that she never needed to check. The hangar at Kingsley Aerospace stood lit like a stage that night, floodlights burning white against a sky gone fully dark. And Samuel arrived for his shift the way he arrived every night, quietly through the side entrance reserved for maintenance and cleaning staff, a cart of solvent and rags trailing behind him. He smelled the trouble before he saw it, the particular tension of too many people standing too still in one place, the low murmur of engineers talking over each other in the clipped defensive register of men who have each already failed. 11 days the jet had sat there, cowling open, its left engine dead as a held note nobody could resolve. He had heard the floor talk about it in fragments over the past week and a half, the way cleaning crews hear everything and are asked about nothing. Vanessa Kingsley stood near the nose of the aircraft in a charcoal suit that had clearly been slept in once this week, her arms crossed, her voice pitched to carry across the whole hangar rather than to the one man she was addressing. 11 days, she was saying, to Tobias Winthrop, who stood with his laptop bag already over one shoulder like a man bracing to be dismissed before the sentence finished. 11 days, a full diagnostic suite, and your entire team, Mr. Winthrop, and I am being told again that you need more time. Her thumb moved to her gold watch, without her seeming to notice she'd done it, a tell Samuel had already clocked from 30 feet away without meaning to. "You don't have more time. The buyer's people fly in Thursday. Pack your team up." Tobias's jaw worked once before he answered, and when he did, his voice had lost its earlier confidence entirely. "Ms. Kingsley, the fault isn't presenting on any of our systems. We've run the full suite twice. Then run it a third time somewhere that isn't my hangar." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room had already gone quiet around her, the particular silence of people watching someone else's humiliation, and grateful it isn't theirs. Tobias's team began packing in 2s and 3s, the sound of laptop cases snapping shut punctuating the stillness like small gavels. Samuel had stopped near the engine without entirely deciding to, his cart parked a few feet back, a rag still in one hand. He was not thinking about the jet. He was thinking, distractedly, about the sound the idle diagnostic equipment was making, a faint electronic hum that didn't quite match the pitch he'd have expected from the fuel pump relay, a half-second of dissonance that most people in this hangar would never register as anything at all. He tilted his head very slightly, an old habit, the kind that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with a decade of listening to machines the way other men listen to a radio left on low in another room. "Can I help you with something?" Vanessa's voice had found him now, sharper than it had been with Tobias, carrying the particular contempt reserved for someone who has wandered somewhere they were never meant to be standing. She was already crossing toward him, her heels sharp against the concrete, her eyes moving once, briskly, over the crooked patch on his shoulder, the rolled sleeves, the pencil behind his ear that had nothing to do with any cleaning task she could imagine. "This is a restricted work area during a technical failure. I need you back on your rounds." "I was listening," Samuel said, which was true, and which was also not remotely the answer she wanted. Listening. She said the word back to him the way a person repeats a foreign phrase they suspect is being used to mock them. Her thumb found her phone. "I don't have time tonight for whatever this is. I have 11 days of my chief engineer's team walking off this floor with nothing, and I don't need the janitor telling me he's listening to my jet." A ripple of laughter moved through the handful of engineers still packing their gear, quick and ugly and gone as fast as it came, the kind of laugh that exists only to relieve pressure rather than express real amusement. "Finish your rounds somewhere else." Samuel didn't move yet. He crouched instead, slowly, unhurried, the motion of a man who has done this exact thing 10,000 times in a different building, with a different badge clipped to his chest, and reached into his coverall pocket for a stub of yellow chalk he kept there out of habit rather than plan. "Ma'am," he said, and it was not a question, and it was not a defense. "Your jet isn't broken where anyone's looking." Vanessa's phone was already at her ear, the first syllable of a name, securities most likely, half formed on her lips, and it was this exact moment, chalk touching concrete, first line drawn beneath the engine's shadow, that the ordinary night began to come apart at its seams without anyone in the hangar quite registering it yet. Nobody stopped him. That was the detail Graham Dalton would think about for weeks afterward, that in a hangar full of certified engineers and one furious CEO, not a single person moved to physically pull the broom pusher off his knees, because on some level beneath their contempt, they were all curious what a man could possibly be doing with a piece of chalk that 11 days of software hadn't already tried. Samuel didn't touch the fuel line. That was the first thing that should have told them something, though none of them were watching closely enough yet to notice. He walked its length instead, hand trailing an inch above the metal without contact, the way a man might walk beside someone he was listening to, rather than something he was inspecting. He crouched every few feet, tilted his head, moved on. The diagnostic laptops sat closed and stacked by the hangar wall where Tobias's team had abandoned them, their answers exhausted, their green and red readouts finally dark. Samuel didn't glance at them once. "He's not even running a scan," one of the departing engineers muttered to another, not quite low enough, the two of them zipping their bags with the particular smugness of men who feel their failure has just been made less lonely. Vanessa Kingsley stood with her phone still in her hand, the call unfinished, watching with an expression that hadn't yet decided between fury and something colder. Curiosity, maybe, though she would not have named it that. Graham Dalton had not moved from where he stood near the hangar's rear bay doors in 14 years' worth of quiet, and he did not move now either, except that his hands, which had been resting on his hips in the posture of a man about to intervene, slowly folded across his chest instead. He knew that walk. He had watched it before, years ago, in a building 3 states away, watched a younger version of the same man pace the length of an engine test stand with exactly that same unhurried attention, exactly that same slight tilt of the head, before delivering a diagnosis nobody else in the building had come within a mile of finding. Graham said nothing. He had known Samuel Nash for 6 years since they'd last worked under the same roof, had known what Samuel used to be, and had never once repeated it to anyone at Kingsley Aerospace, because Samuel had never asked him to keep the secret and had also never once suggested he wanted it told. Samuel crouched at last near the fuel metering assembly, chalk already in hand, and drew his first line, not decorative, not idle, but following the exact geometry of a harmonic he was mapping in his head, a pattern of resonance points that would have meant nothing to a diagnostic laptop, because a diagnostic laptop only measured what it had been told to look for. Claire had shown him this on a napkin once, years before either of them had ever set foot in an aircraft hangar, back when she was still teaching structural mechanics on the side, and he was still an engineer nobody outside his own division had heard of. "An engine's design tells you what it should do," she'd said. "It never tells you what it's not doing. For that you have to go looking yourself." The second line crossed the first at an angle that made Tobias Winthrop stop halfway through zipping his bag, his eyes narrowing, some old training reasserting itself against his own humiliation. "That's not a diagnostic pattern," he said to no one in particular, though it came out sounding less certain than he meant it to. "It's not meant to be one," Samuel said, without looking up. The mockery in the room had gone quiet somewhere in the last several minutes without anyone deciding to let it. What replaced it was worse, in its way, an unease that moved through the remaining engineers like cold air finding a gap under a door because a man in a crooked patch was doing something none of them recognized with total confidence in a room where confidence had just been systematically stripped from everyone credentialed enough to have earned it honestly. Vanessa lowered her phone from her ear, though she did not put it away. She had stopped composing the sentence that would have him removed. She had started instead to watch his hands, which moved without hesitation, without a single false start, the way a person's hands move only when the rest of them has already solved the problem and is simply waiting for the fingers to catch up. Samuel drew the third line, then the fourth, and stood, dusting the chalk from his fingers onto his coverall, and looked, for the first time since he'd knelt down, directly at the jet's open engine bay, the way a man looks at someone he has just finished listening to very carefully. "There," he said, "right there. You've been chasing a valve that reads correctly and behaves incorrectly. That's not a sensor fault. That's a part that isn't what its paperwork says it is." Nobody in the hangar spoke. Vanessa Kingsley's thumb, for the first time all night, had gone still on the surface of her phone. Samuel Nash reached into the engine bay with the unhurried patience of a man who had done this exact motion thousands of times in a building none of them would ever see, and pressed 2 fingers against the housing of the fuel metering valve sitting at the 4th intersection of his own chalk lines. He didn't remove it yet. He simply held it there, feeling for the faint resistance under his fingertips that the diagnostic software had never been built to feel at all, and said, mostly to himself, "There's a filed edge here that shouldn't exist on a factory part." Then he looked up, found Tobias Winthrop's eyes across the hangar, and asked in the flat, unbothered tone of a man asking for a screwdriver rather than delivering a verdict, "Do you have the maintenance log from the last valve replacement on this engine?" Tobias didn't answer right away. He crossed the floor instead, phone forgotten in his jacket pocket, and crouched beside Samuel with the particular reluctance of a man forced to look closely at something he'd already convinced himself couldn't be there. He ran his thumb along the same filed edge Samuel had just described. His face changed in stages, disbelief first, then something closer to nausea. "This part number," he said slowly, "doesn't match what's stamped on the housing. Someone ground the original number off and re-stamped it." 6 minutes, Samuel said, not to Tobias, not to Vanessa, but to the engine itself, the way a man might address something he'd been arguing with for a long time and had finally won. He worked the housing free with hands that never hesitated, replaced it with a spare pulled from the parts cart he'd wheeled in an hour earlier, without anyone questioning why a cleaning cart carried a spare valve at all, and reseated the assembly with 4 turns of a wrench he produced from his coverall pocket like a man who had never stopped carrying his own tools, even after he'd stopped calling himself an engineer. He straightened, wiped his hands on a rag, and said only, "Try it now." Tobias climbed into the cockpit himself rather than send anyone else, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something raw. The engine turned over on the second attempt, caught, and rose into a low, even roar that filled the hangar and rattled loose bolts on a parts shelf 30 feet away. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke at all. For a long moment, the whole floor held in a silence thick enough to feel, broken only by the engine's steady, healthy pulse. The sound 11 days and 11 engineers had failed to produce, delivered in 6 minutes by a man in a coverall with chalk dust still on his knees. Vanessa Kingsley stood very still, her phone finally lowered all the way, her gold watch catching the floodlights without her once glancing at it. She looked at Samuel the way a person looks at a door they've walked past for years without ever noticing it opened onto another room. It was Graham Dalton who broke the silence, stepping forward at last from where he'd stood, unmoving near the bay doors, his voice carrying flat and plain across the whole hangar floor. "That's Samuel Nash," he said. "He used to run propulsion systems for a defense contractor bigger than this whole company. He built the method your engineers just failed to use." Nobody laughed this time. The part number sat on Graham Dalton's laptop screen at 11 that night, cross-referenced against the manufacturer's full catalog 3 separate times, and 3 separate times it returned nothing. Not discontinued, not superseded, non-existent, a string of digits belonging to no fuel metering valve any certified supplier had ever produced. Samuel stood behind Graham's shoulder in the otherwise empty hangar office, arms crossed, watching the same blank result resolve on the screen with the patience of a man who had already suspected what he'd find before he found it. "Somebody made this number up," Graham said, "and somebody else stamped it onto a real part and got it installed on a $9 million aircraft." He looked up at Samuel. "That's not a mistake you make by accident." Tobias Winthrop arrived at the office door before either of them could say more. Still in his flight jacket, his earlier humiliation curdled now into something defensive. He'd spent the last hour, it turned out, drafting an incident report of his own, and he set it on the desk between them with the too careful posture of a man presenting something he already suspects won't hold. "I'm filing this as a clerical mislabeling during the last parts shipment," he said. "Supplier error. It happens more than people think." Samuel read the single paragraph without reaching for it, upside down, the way a man reads something he's already decided isn't true. "You signed the inspection that passed this valve," he said, not unkindly. "If it's a clerical error, it's yours." Tobias's jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to hide anything." "You're trying to make a filed-down serial number sound like a typo," Graham said, and there was no cruelty in it. Only the flatness of a man who'd worked a hangar floor for 14 years and had heard every version of this exact sentence before. "It won't hold, Tobias. Not once someone else looks at it." The three of them stood in a silence that had nothing companionable in it, until Vanessa Kingsley's assistant appeared in the doorway, breathless in the specific way of someone who has been sent to deliver news nobody wants delivered at midnight. "Ms. Kingsley needs everyone in the main office," she said. "The buyer's council just called. They're saying the 11-day failure is a material safety concern, and they want the purchase price on the charter division renegotiated before Thursday's signing, or they're prepared to walk." Samuel felt something shift in the room the way he'd once felt an airframe shift under stress testing, a change in load nobody had accounted for. $83 million, 6 days from signing, and a jet that had been fixed in 6 minutes was suddenly less important than the parts log explaining why it had ever needed fixing at all. Then we'd better find out how many more of these there are," Samuel said quietly, and Graham was already turning back to the laptop before he finished the sentence, pulling up the maintenance history not just for one aircraft, but for the whole Kingsley Aerospace fleet. It took the two of them the better part of 2 days, working the hangar's records the way Samuel had once worked engine data, patiently, methodically, checking each figure against itself rather than trusting what the summary page claimed. By the second evening, Graham's screen held 11 separate maintenance entries across 7 different aircraft, each one referencing a valve or a sensor, housing with a part number the manufacturer's catalog had never issued, each one signed off within the last 18 months by an approval code that didn't belong to Tobias or to any hangar floor engineer at all, but to Kingsley Aerospace's chief of procurement, a name neither of them had reason to look at twice until that moment: Bertram Aldington. "Procurement doesn't sign off on individual part installs," Graham said slowly, scrolling back through the log a second time as though the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less troubling. "That's not his job. That's not anyone's job above the floor level." "It is if you're routing contracts somewhere specific," Samuel said, "and you don't want anyone on the floor asking why." Vanessa Kingsley sat alone in her office that same night with the fleet procurement file open across her desk, invoices going back 9 years spread in overlapping fans of paper, because she had stopped trusting the digital summaries an hour into reading them. She found the authorization near midnight, tucked into a folder marked routine, and filed the year Bertram Aldington had first been hired, a signature at the bottom approving an early supplier contract with a company she'd never heard her father mention, in a hand she recognized instantly because she had spent her whole childhood watching it sign birthday cards and report cards and, eventually, the papers that made this company hers. Her father's signature, dated 9 years ago. 3 months, she realized, with a stillness that felt very far away from her body after he had died. She sat with the page a long time before she picked up the phone, and when she finally called down to the hangar, her voice had none of the sharpness it had carried 6 nights earlier, only something quieter and far more dangerous. "I need Samuel Nash," she said, "and I need Bertram Aldington in the boardroom by 9 tomorrow morning, and I need every invoice this hangar has signed in the last 9 years brought up with them. The boardroom at 9 the next morning held more people than it was built to hold comfortably, though nobody seemed inclined to sit. Bertram Aldington stood near the head of the table, in a suit that fit him the way expensive things fit men who have worn them for decades without ever quite earning them, his expression composed into the particular calm of a man who still believes, in the first several minutes, that whatever is coming can be managed. Tobias Winthrop stood near the window, a printed page in his hand that he kept folding and unfolding along the same crease. Graham Dalton stood by the door. Samuel stood beside him, still in his coverall, chalk dust long since brushed from his knees, but the pencil still tucked behind one ear out of habit rather than need. Vanessa laid 11 invoices across the table without preamble, each one bearing an identical filed-down part number, each one routed through a supplier registered under a name that traced, after 3 phone calls that morning, to a company owned in significant part by Bertram Aldington's brother-in-law. 9 years, she said, of maintenance contracts routed away from our certified suppliers and toward a company you hold an undisclosed stake in, depressing the value of my fleet while inflating theirs, ahead of what I can only assume is your own plan to sell it. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to, and a signature on the founding contract belonging to my father, dated 3 months after he died. The room went very quiet. Bertram's composure held for exactly as long as it took him to look down at the forged signature himself, and something in his face gave way beneath it, the particular collapse of a man who has spent so long managing a lie that he has forgotten what his own face does when it finally stops. "I need everyone to hear exactly what happened here," Vanessa said, in plain language, on the record, before this goes any further. She turned to Tobias first, not unkindly. "Start with your report." Tobias unfolded the page in his hand one final time and read from it in a voice stripped of its earlier defensiveness. "I signed an inspection I shouldn't have passed," he said. "I filed the valve discrepancy as a clerical error, because admitting it wasn't one meant admitting I'd missed something a night shift custodian caught in 6 minutes. That was wrong. The part was deliberately mislabeled, and I should have said so the moment I saw it." Bertram did not deny the rest. He had built, over 9 years, a case so carefully layered that he had perhaps convinced himself it would never need defending, and confronted now with 11 invoices and a dead man's forged hand, he offered no elaborate justification, only a short, flat admission about a supplier stake he'd never disclosed and a valuation he'd been quietly protecting for longer than Vanessa had run the company at all. It was, in the end, a small and almost bureaucratic unraveling. No raised voices, no confrontation beyond the plain reading of documents already speaking for themselves. Afterward, when the room had mostly emptied and the invoices had been gathered into a folder that would travel next to legal counsel, Vanessa found Samuel by the boardroom's tall windows, looking out at the tarmac where the jet now sat with its engine cowling closed. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone who you used to be?" she asked. It was not an accusation. It came out instead like a question she had been sitting with since midnight 2 nights before. Samuel reached into his coverall and drew out a folded piece of paper, soft at its creases from years of handling, and opened it flat on the windowsill between them. It was a hand-drawn schematic, penciled on the back of what had once been a hospital intake form, fuel flow notations running along one margin in a hand that wasn't his. "My wife drew this," he said. "She was a structural engineer before she got sick. She used to say an engine never lies, it just waits for someone patient enough to ask it the right question." He looked at the schematic rather than at Vanessa. "I wasn't hiding who I used to be. I just stopped needing anyone to know it." Vanessa studied the drawing for a long moment, then looked up. "I'd like to give you a title. Back pay for what it's worth. For 6 years of being underpaid on a hangar floor while doing work none of my engineers could." She said it plainly, without performance, the offer of a woman trying, clumsily, to correct something in the only language she had ever been taught to use. Samuel folded the schematic closed again before he answered. "I don't want a title," he said. "Start an independent audit fund for every part that comes through this hangar. Don't put my name on it. Put no one's name on it. Just make sure the next person who finds something wrong doesn't need 6 minutes and a piece of chalk to be believed." 3 months later, the charter division sale closed at its full original price, $83 million, the buyer's counsel satisfied by an independent audit report that named no one and protected everyone. And the ceremony that marked it took place in the same boardroom where Bertram Aldington's signature forging had come apart into plain daylight, though nobody mentioned that irony aloud. Tobias Winthrop still worked the hangar floor most days, though something in how he carried himself there had changed permanently. He deferred to Samuel now on anything involving fuel systems without needing to be asked twice, and had taken in recent weeks to writing his inspection notes in a slower, more deliberate hand, as though he'd learned that speed had never been the thing that mattered. Samuel could have left the cleaning contract behind entirely. The audit fund's charter, once it was finally drafted and signed, offered him a formal role advising it, a salary that would have dwarfed anything the hangar floor had ever paid him. He kept the cleaning shift anyway, one night a week, by his own choice rather than necessity, because there was a particular quiet to that hangar after midnight that he had never found anywhere else, and because Graham Dalton still liked the company on the slow nights, and because some part of him had never entirely wanted to be seen as anything more than a man who noticed things carefully. At home, on a Saturday afternoon with the garage door raised to let in the last warm light of the season, Winnie knelt on the concrete floor of their own garage with a stub of chalk she'd found in her father's toolbox, and drew 4 lines, crossing and uncrossing them the way she'd watched him do it from the edge of the hangar bay, the one time he'd brought her along on a quiet afternoon shift. She didn't know what the lines meant. She only knew her father had drawn something like them once, and that whatever it was, it had mattered. Samuel watched her from the doorway, a mug of coffee cooling in one hand, and said nothing, the way Claire had once let him work through a problem without interrupting him, trusting the shape of it to arrive on its own. His toolbox sat closed on the workbench behind him, Claire's schematic folded and tucked back inside its lid where it had always lived, worn soft at every crease from years of being carried and rarely, ever, shown. If you believe the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who already solved it, you know exactly what this story is about. Winnie looked up from her 4 uneven lines, satisfied with them in the plain, unbothered way children are satisfied with things adults spend a lifetime learning to be proud of quietly, and asked her father if she'd drawn them right. Sam.